Let the record show the defendant has no respect for this institution. Her background, her associations, people like her simply don't understand boundaries. She's a flight risk, Your Honor. Bail should be denied.
I saw him put the evidence in the bag. He's lying. Objection!
Judge Ruble, you're not on this docket.
I am entering this case. Consider your bar license
But her hands were
threatened.
already gripping the pew in front of her.
Wait, what?
The doors behind her seemed to grow heavier with every second she stayed silent. Then she stood. Objection. Every head in the gallery turned. The presiding judge frowned, searching for the source of the interruption. He found a woman he recognized instantly, because everyone in the state judiciary recognized Cynthia Ruble. Judge Ruble, he said slowly, you're not on this docket. I am now. Cynthia walked forward, unbuttoning her coat to reveal a suit sharp enough to cut glass. That defendant is my niece. And if opposing counsel repeats one more thinly veiled slur for the record, I will personally see to it that his bar license doesn't survive the week. The prosecutor's smile faltered. Angelina looked up at her aunt for the first time in 6 years and didn't know whether to feel saved or terrified. Because Cynthia Ruble didn't do mercy. She did the law. Cold, exact, and absolute. And she was about to find out that this case went far deeper than a single bigoted prosecutor. Straight to the top of a company with a lot to lose if the truth ever reached a jury. The morning light through the high windows of Courtroom 4B did nothing to soften the room. It fell in cold gray bars across the defense table, where Angelina Ruble sat with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The county jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against skin that had never worn anything but tailored blazers and the soft cotton of trading floor casual Fridays. Her hair, usually swept back in a neat, professional twist, had been pulled into a hasty bun that morning by hands that were shaking too badly to do a proper job of it. Beside her, the public defender assigned to her case flipped through a manila folder with the distracted urgency of a man juggling 6 other disasters that same week. His tie was crooked. His coffee, cold and forgotten, sat sweating a ring onto the table's polished wood. He mumbled something about a motion he hadn't finished drafting, more to himself than to her, and Angelina realized with a sinking, hollow certainty that this man, kind as he might be, overworked as he clearly was, had no idea what he was about to walk into. He didn't understand perpetual futures contracts, or order flow manipulation, or the difference between a legitimate stop-loss cascade and a deliberately engineered one. He understood plea deals and docket numbers and the particular exhaustion of a system that processed people like inventory. She was innocent. She knew she was innocent. But innocence, she was beginning to learn, was a fact that meant almost nothing in a room built to process guilt efficiently. At the back of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors opened without a sound, the kind of quiet that came from someone who had spent decades learning exactly how much pressure a hinge could take before it complained. Judge Cynthia Ruble stepped inside and immediately moved to the last row of the gallery, settling into the shadowed corner where the morning light didn't reach. She kept her coat buttoned, her expression neutral, her posture the rigid, unreadable posture of a woman who had spent her entire career being watched and had long ago perfected the art of watching without being seen. She told herself she was here only to observe. That was the story she'd repeated to herself on the drive over, in the elevator, in the hallway outside. Observe. Nothing more. She was not here to intervene. because intervening would mean admitting that some part of her still cared what happened to Angelina Ruble. Caring was a door she had kept firmly shut for 6 years. The truth was more complicated, and she knew it, even as she refused to examine it too closely. She did not know, with any real certainty, whether her niece was innocent. The reports she'd read, the ones she wasn't supposed to have access to, pulled through channels a sitting appellate judge shouldn't technically use, painted a picture of massive irregularities in the firm's trading logs, discrepancies attributed to Angelina's algorithms, numbers that didn't reconcile. She had believed, coldly and analytically, that there was at least a reasonable chance her niece had done exactly what she was accused of. Brilliant people did desperate things. She had presided over enough cases to know that talent and integrity were not the same currency, and one did not guarantee the other. So she sat, she watched. She waited to see, with her own eyes, what kind of person her niece had become in the years since they'd stopped speaking. The bail hearing began exactly on schedule. The presiding judge, a heavy-set man named Holloway who had a reputation for moving through his docket with brisk indifference, called the case and gestured for the prosecution to proceed. The prosecutor, who rose to his feet, had the polished, confident bearing of a man who had never once doubted his own righteousness. He wore a suit that fit a shade too well for a public servant's salary, and he adjusted his tie with a small, theatrical flourish before he began, as if he were settling in to enjoy himself. Your Honor, the people strongly object to any consideration of bail in this matter. His voice carried easily, pitched for the room. The defendant stands accused of orchestrating a scheme that cost her employer tens of millions of dollars. But beyond the financial damage, I think it's important the court understand the full picture of who we're dealing with here. He paused, letting the moment stretch, and Angelina felt her stomach drop, even before he continued. The defendant's background, her associations, her upbringing, speaks to a fundamental lack of respect for the institutions that built this country's financial system. People like her don't see these firms as places of trust. They see them as targets, as opportunities. It's not about maliciousness, so much as it is a cultural blind spot, if you will, when it comes to understanding boundaries that the rest of us take for granted. Given that pattern, given who she is, and where she comes from, the people believe she represents a substantial and unpredictable flight risk. The words landed in the silent courtroom, like something physical. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery, a shifting of weight, a lowering of eyes, the particular quiet of people who recognized exactly what they had just heard and weren't sure whether they were allowed to react to it. The public defender beside Angelina opened his mouth, as if to object, then closed it again, apparently unsure of the grounds, or perhaps simply unwilling to pick the fight. Angelina sat very still. She had heard versions of this language her entire life, dressed up in slightly different clothes each time, and she had learned long ago that the worst thing she could do in a room like this was let her face show what it cost her to hear it. So she kept her expression flat, her spine straight, and stared at a point on the table in front of her, refusing to give the man the reaction he was fishing for. In the back row, something in Cynthia Ruble went very cold and very still. She had built her entire career, her entire identity, around the belief that the law, properly applied, rigorously interpreted, was the one truly impartial force available to imperfect people. She had told herself for 6 years that her estrangement from her brother's family was simply the price of that belief, the necessary distance a person maintained when they refused to let personal loyalty corrupt professional judgment. She had watched her brother make a foolish, minor legal mistake once, years ago, and she had refused to lift a single finger to help him, because the law didn't bend for family, and she wasn't going to be the judge who taught her own relatives that it should. But this wasn't the law. This was something else wearing the law's clothing, and every instinct she'd spent 30 years honing told her exactly what she was looking at. She rose from the pew. The scrape of her chair was small, but the room was so tightly wound that it seemed to echo. Heads turned. Judge Holloway's gaze found her first, and his expression shifted from mild irritation at the interruption to something closer to alarm as recognition set in. "Objection," Cynthia said, and her voice, trained over decades to fill rooms twice this size without ever rising to a shout, cut through the space with absolute clarity. Counsel's argument is not a flight risk assessment. It is a racially coded character assassination, and if the court intends to entertain it as a legitimate basis for denying bail, I would strongly suggest reviewing the transcript before this matter reaches an appellate bench, because I promise you, it will. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. "Judge Ruble, you're not on this docket. I'm going to need you to." "I'm aware I'm not on the docket, Your Honor." Cynthia was already walking down the center aisle, unbuttoning her coat as she moved, revealing the sharp charcoal suit beneath it. "I'm entering my appearance now. Angelina Ruble is my niece, and as of this moment, I am filing as her defense counsel of record." A murmur swept through the gallery. The prosecutor's confident expression cracked for the first time, something like genuine uncertainty flickering across his face as he watched a sitting appellate judge cross the well of the courtroom toward the defense table. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he said, recovering some of his composure. Judge Ruble has no standing to simply, "I have a law license, counsel, same as you," Cynthia said, not breaking stride. "It doesn't expire when I put on a robe, and unless you'd like to explain, on the record, exactly what you meant by people like her, I'd suggest you sit down and reconsider your next sentence very carefully." She reached the defense table and set her hand briefly, lightly, on the back of the empty chair beside her niece. It was the only gesture of warmth she allowed herself, and even that felt like it cost her something. Angelina finally raised her eyes to her aunt, 6 years of silence collapsing into a single look, complicated and painful, disbelief and relief, and something that looked almost like fear, because she had spent her whole life hearing stories about how cold Cynthia Ruble could be, and she had no idea, in this moment, whether she was being rescued or simply witnessing her aunt's principles finally catching fire in someone else's defense. The overwhelmed public defender, for his part, looked entirely too relieved to protest. He gathered his files quietly, glad to hand the case off, and didn't return to the defense table again. Judge Holloway took a long moment, visibly recalculating the entire trajectory of his morning, before he sighed and gestured toward the defense table. "Judge Ruble is entered as counsel of record for the defendant. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Counsel, I'd suggest you use the time to reconsider your bail argument, because right now it's not going to survive a written motion, let alone an appeal." The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted into the low roar of 100 whispered conversations, and the prosecutor gathered his papers with the stiff, controlled movements of a man trying very hard not to look rattled in front of an audience. Cynthia didn't watch him go. She was already looking at her niece, and for the first time since she'd walked through those oak doors, her carefully maintained neutrality had entirely deserted her. The holding cell, where they were permitted to meet, was a narrow, windowless room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs that had clearly been designed for brief, unpleasant conversations rather than comfortable ones. A guard stood outside the reinforced door, close enough to intervene, far enough to grant the illusion of privacy. Angelina sat with her wrists still marked faintly, from the cuffs she'd worn during transport, and Cynthia sat across from her, with a legal pad she hadn't yet written a single word on. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick with 6 years of unanswered calls and unread messages, and holidays spent at separate tables. "You didn't have to do that," Angelina finally said. Her voice was rougher than she intended, worn down by exhaustion and the particular strain of trying not to cry in a room full of strangers. "You could have just watched. You didn't have to stand up." "No," Cynthia agreed. "I didn't." "Then why did you?" Cynthia set the legal pad down and folded her hands on the table, and when she spoke, Her voice had lost the courtroom precision it carried moments earlier. It sounded, instead, almost uncertain. An unfamiliar register for a woman who had spent 30 years being certain of everything. Because what I heard in that room wasn't law. It was theater, dressed up as law. And I have spent my entire career trying to make sure the difference between those two things actually matters. I couldn't sit there and let it happen in front of me. Not to anyone. And especially not to you. Whatever I believe about what you did or didn't do. Angelina flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the qualifier. You still think I did it? I don't know what you did, Cynthia said, with the same brutal honesty she applied to everything, including herself. I've read the reports. There are irregularities in the trading logs that point toward you. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending I walked in here already convinced of your innocence. I walked in here to observe. That's all I intended to do. Of course you did. Something bitter crept into Angelina's voice now. 6 years of hurt finally finding an outlet. That's exactly who you are. You couldn't even give me the benefit of the doubt walking through the door. You never could give any of us the benefit of the doubt. Angelina, you let Dad go to court alone. The words came out sharper than Angelina intended, but she didn't take them back. You remember that? A parking dispute that turned into some ridiculous municipal code violation, completely beneath you, and he asked you, his own sister, a judge, just to make one phone call, just to help him understand what he was walking into, and you told him the law doesn't bend for family. You told him you wouldn't be the judge who taught her relatives it should. He came home from that hearing humiliated, and you weren't even there to see it, because you'd already decided your reputation mattered more than showing up for him. The words hit their mark. Cynthia's expression didn't change much. Decades of judicial training kept her face largely still. But something in her eyes flickered, a crack in the armor that had taken 6 years to form. You're right, she said finally, quietly. I did tell him that, and I believed it when I said it. I still believe, in the abstract, that the law shouldn't bend for the people who happen to share your blood. That belief is the entire foundation of what I've built my career on. But I have had a long time to sit with what that belief cost us, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it didn't cost us everything. Then why is this different? Why am I different? Because what's happening to you isn't the law failing to bend, Cynthia said. It's the law being weaponized. There's a difference between refusing to give someone unfair advantage and refusing to stop someone from being unfairly destroyed. I was wrong about where that line sat with your father. I don't think I'm wrong about where it sits now. And I am not going to make the same mistake twice, whatever it costs me this time. Angelina studied her aunt's face for a long moment, searching for the performance she half expected to find there, and not finding it. Cynthia Ruble had never been an easy woman to read, but she had also never, in Angelina's memory, been dishonest. I didn't do this, Angelina said finally, quieter now, the anger draining out of her voice and leaving something more exhausted and more honest in its place. I built those trading frameworks to be transparent, auditable. Every rule-based decision the algorithm made was supposed to be traceable back to a documented parameter. If there's money missing, it's not because my systems hid it. Someone changed something after the fact, or built a shadow process I never had access to. Then that's where we start, Cynthia said. Not with what I believe, with what the evidence actually shows, and what it doesn't. I'm not asking you to convince me you're innocent, Angelina. I'm asking you to help me prove it. Because if what you're saying is true, the proof exists somewhere in that firm's systems, and I intend to find it. For the first time since her arrest, something loosened in Angelina's chest. Not trust, not yet, not fully, but the first fragile suggestion that trust might eventually be possible again. The discovery files arrived 3 days later, in 6 heavy boxes, dumped unceremoniously onto a folding table in the cramped windowless room the county provided for defense preparation. Cynthia worked through them with the same relentless, methodical focus she brought to appellate briefs. annotating margins, flagging inconsistencies, building a timeline on a whiteboard that grew more elaborate with each passing hour. What she found, buried in the forensic reports the prosecution had commissioned, troubled her more than she let herself show. The digital forensics team had reconstructed a set of trading logs that supposedly demonstrated Angelina's algorithms executing a series of manipulative trades in the hours before the losses occurred. But the metadata was inconsistent in ways that shouldn't have existed if the analysis had been done properly. Timestamps that didn't align with the exchange's own server logs, a gap in the audit trail exactly where the most damaging trades supposedly originated. A forensic signature that, to Cynthia's trained eye, looked less like an investigation and more like a narrative constructed backward from a predetermined conclusion. "They didn't reconstruct what happened," she muttered late one evening, staring at a printout under the harsh fluorescent light. "They reconstructed what they needed to have happened." Angelina, sitting across from her, surrounded by her own printouts of the algorithm's original architecture, looked up sharply. "You're saying the forensics are fabricated?" "I'm saying the forensics have holes large enough to drive a verdict through, and I intend to make every single one of them visible to a jury." Cynthia circled a discrepancy in red ink, her expression hardening into the particular focus that had made her a terror on the appellate bench for 2 decades. Whoever built this case was sloppy, or arrogant, or both. Either way, it's a mistake I intend to exploit. Word of exactly how effectively Cynthia was dismantling the discovery reached the prosecutor faster than either of them expected. He arrived at the next pretrial conference with a motion already drafted, and the confident swagger he'd carried into the original bail hearing had curdled into something more brittle, more calculating. "Your Honor," he announced, addressing Judge Holloway with exaggerated formality. "The people moved to disqualify Judge Ruble as defense counsel on grounds of conflict of interest. Her position as a sitting appellate judge, combined with her familial relationship to the defendant, creates an irreconcilable ethical entanglement that threatens the integrity of these proceedings." Judge Holloway looked, if anything, faintly relieved at the prospect of removing the complication currently disrupting his docket. "Judge Ruble, I'll hear your response." Cynthia rose without hurry, entirely unbothered, the ghost of something almost amused crossing her features. "Your Honor, opposing counsel is welcome to file whatever motions he likes, but I'd point him toward the State Bar's own ethics opinions on this exact question, specifically the appellate decision in Whitfield v. State Bar, which explicitly permits a sitting judge to serve as counsel in matters entirely outside their own jurisdiction, provided appropriate recusal protocols are followed regarding any future appellate review. I have already filed formal recusal from any case touching this firm, this prosecutor, or this courtroom for as long as I sit on the appellate bench. There is no conflict here, Your Honor, only opposing counsel's discomfort at facing a defense attorney who actually reads the statutes he's attempting to weaponize." The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond and found, for a long, uncomfortable moment, that he had nothing ready to say. He hadn't expected her to have the citation memorized, hadn't expected the recusal filing to already exist, hadn't expected to be standing in front of a room, watching his own motion collapse under the weight of a precedent he clearly hadn't bothered to check. "The motion is denied," Judge Holloway said, with the flat finality of a man who had already decided this case was going to be a headache, regardless of what he ruled. "Counsel, in the future, I'd suggest doing your homework before you bring me paperwork." The gallery, small as it was, allowed itself a ripple of quiet reaction, something between surprise and satisfaction. The prosecutor gathered his files with considerably less swagger than he'd arrived with, and as he passed the defense table, Cynthia caught the flicker of something new in his expression. Not just frustration, something closer to worry. The look of a man beginning to realize he had badly underestimated the woman sitting across from him. Angelina watched the entire exchange with something shifting visibly behind her eyes. For 6 years, she had known her aunt only through the flat, distant reputation that preceded her. The immovable judge, the woman who prized rules over relationships, who had let her own brother walk into a courtroom alone rather than bend an inch. She had grown up believing that rigidity was the whole of who Cynthia Ruble was, a coldness with no purpose beyond itself. But watching her now, watching that same unbending precision turned like a blade against the people trying to destroy her, Angelina began, for the first time, to understand that her aunt's strictness had never been the absence of feeling. It had simply never before been pointed in her direction. "You really did memorize that citation," Angelina said afterward, once they were alone again, something almost like a smile threatening the corner of her mouth for the first time in weeks. "I memorize all of them," Cynthia said, not looking up from the discovery file. She was already back to annotating. "It's considerably more useful than most people assume. I used to think you were just hard, all the way through, no give anywhere." Cynthia's pen paused for a moment over the page. "I am hard, Angelina. I don't think that's going to change, and I'm not sure I'd want it to. But hard isn't the same thing as pointed in the wrong direction. I spent a long time aiming it at the wrong people, including your father, including you. I intend to spend whatever time I have left aiming it somewhere that actually matters." For the first time since the arraignment, Angelina let herself believe, not completely, not without reservation, but enough, that the woman across the table wasn't merely defending her. She was, in her own severe and uncompromising way, finally coming home. It was well past midnight when Angelina finally found it, buried 3 folders deep in a dataset she'd forced herself to stop avoiding, the liquidity mapping records from the weeks before her arrest, the ones she'd built herself, the ones she knew better than anyone alive. She'd been staring at the screen for so long her eyes had gone dry and unfocused, and she almost missed it the first time through. A series of order book snapshots that shouldn't have existed in the format they were saved in, time-stamped in a window. Her own system logs said she'd been logged out entirely. "Cynthia." Her voice cracked slightly, urgency cutting through the exhaustion. "Cynthia, come look at this." Cynthia crossed the cramped room in 3 strides and leaned over her niece's shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything as Angelina scrolled through screen after screen of data, her hands trembling slightly with the particular adrenaline of finally seeing a shape emerge from what had looked, for weeks, like meaningless noise. "These are liquidity maps," Angelina said, pointing at a cluster of numbers. "They show where large clusters of stop losses and liquidation triggers were sitting in the perpetual futures order book. Someone used this exact data only accessible through my framework's internal API, to place a series of trades specifically designed to cascade through those clusters. Not random trades, surgical ones. Whoever did this knew exactly where the market was fragile and pushed on it deliberately. Someone drained the contracts on purpose," Cynthia said slowly, the picture assembling itself in her mind with the cold clarity she brought to every case she'd ever taken apart. "And then blamed your algorithm for the collapse. It gets worse." Angelina pulled up another file, her jaw tightening. The access logs for this API were supposed to be immutable. Append only, time-stamped, impossible to alter without leaving a trace. But look here. She highlighted a block of code. Someone rewrote a chunk of the audit trail after the fact. Badly. They left artifacts. Whoever did this wasn't a trader. They didn't understand order flow mechanics well enough to know that liquidity mapping at this level requires firm-wide administrative access. Traders don't have that. Compliance officers don't have that. Who does? Angelina looked up at her aunt, and something cold and certain settled over her features. The CEO, Marcus Castellan. Direct system-level access to every trading desk's proprietary framework was a privilege he insisted on keeping for himself, officially for oversight purposes. "I fought him on it 18 months ago. Lost." Cynthia straightened, and for a moment she simply stood in the dim, fluorescent-lit room, turning the shape of the conspiracy over in her mind the way she might turn over an especially elegant piece of case law, appreciating, even as it disgusted her, the precision of the trap that had been built. Castellan hadn't merely embezzled funds. He had engineered a controlled collapse of his own firm's positions, drained tens of millions of dollars into channels only he could trace, and then handed the blame to the one employee whose technical brilliance made her the most convincing scapegoat available. It was, in its own ruthless way, an almost admirable piece of architecture. "He used your own genius as camouflage," she said quietly. He knew a jury wouldn't understand the difference between a sophisticated framework being exploited and a sophisticated framework being the weapon. He was counting on the complexity working against you. So what do we do with it? We don't move yet. Cynthia's mind was already 3 steps ahead, mapping the legal terrain the way she'd once mapped appellate strategy for cases that mattered far less than this one. If we bring this to the prosecution now, in this raw form, they'll have time to explain it away, bury it, claim it's speculative. We need the money trail, not just the mechanism, the destination. Where did those drained funds actually go? Angelina was already shaking her head slowly, a grim, humorless smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, for the first time in what felt like months. That's the part he definitely didn't expect anyone to find. Give me a few more days. The envelope arrived without a return address, slipped beneath the door of Cynthia's chambers, sometime between the end of the evening session and the janitorial staff's rounds. She almost dismissed it as court business, until she opened it and found a single unsigned page, typed in a plain, untraceable font, the kind of anonymity that took deliberate effort to construct. Judge Ruble, your pension, your bench, your entire career took 30 years to build. It would be a shame to watch it dismantled over a case that was never yours to fight. Withdraw as counsel. Let the process run its natural course. Consider this your only warning. She read it twice, then a third time, searching for a tremor in her own hands that never came. What she felt instead, sitting alone in the quiet of her chambers with the letter flat on the desk before her, was something colder and far more useful than fear. Recognition. Whoever had sent this had confirmed, in the clumsiest possible way, exactly how close she and Angelina had come to the truth. A man confident in his innocence did not send anonymous threats. He filed motions. He hired lawyers. He let the process, as the letter so cynically put it, run its course, because he trusted it to acquit him. This was the language of a man who understood, with rising panic, that the process was no longer running in his favor. She did not report the letter through official channels, not yet. Instead, she made a series of calls that evening from her home study, the kind of calls that drew on 30 years of favors quietly accumulated and rarely spent. A federal magistrate she'd clerked alongside decades earlier, now sitting in a district with jurisdiction, over the exact category of offshore holding company the CEO favored. A former law school classmate who now worked in financial crimes enforcement. A court reporter's husband who happened to sit on the compliance board of an international banking consortium. She did not ask any of them for favors that crossed ethical lines. She asked only for the truth to move slightly faster than it otherwise would have, and by morning, she had drafted a subpoena so thoroughly researched, so airtight in its jurisdictional grounding, that even Castellan's formidable legal team would find almost nothing to challenge. The subpoena reached his offshore holding entities 3 days later, compelling the production of financial records spanning 18 months of shell company transfers, entity restructurings, and wire activity that had been, until that moment, walled off behind layers of jurisdictional complexity, specifically designed to discourage exactly this kind of scrutiny. When his lead attorney called to protest, his voice carrying the particular outrage of a man watching an expensive strategy unravel, Cynthia listened to the entire tirade, without interrupting once. "You understand," he said finally, "that pursuing this line of inquiry could have serious professional consequences for you personally." "I received a letter to that effect 3 days ago," Cynthia said pleasantly, and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work for her. I'd be very careful about repeating its contents on a recorded line. Counsel. Attempting to intimidate a sitting judge, even one acting as defense counsel, carries consequences considerably more serious than anything you're currently worried about. She hung up before he could respond, and for the first time since Angelina's arraignment, she allowed herself something close to satisfaction. The trial began on a gray Tuesday morning, the courtroom packed tighter than it had been for any of the pretrial hearings, word having spread through the local legal community that something unusual was unfolding in courtroom 4B. The prosecution opened with confidence, laying out a narrative of a brilliant, resentful analyst who had exploited her technical access to punish a firm she believed had undervalued her. A story built, Cynthia noted with grim satisfaction, almost entirely on inference and character, rather than hard technical evidence, because the technical evidence, as she well knew, didn't actually exist in the form they needed it to. Their first major witness was a heavyset man named Dr. A. Whitcomb, introduced to the jury with an impressive-sounding string of credentials: a doctorate in financial engineering, consulting work for 2 other major trading firms, a resume clearly assembled to project unimpeachable authority on the subject of algorithmic trading systems. He testified for nearly an hour under the prosecutor's careful, leading questions, describing in confident, jargon-heavy language how Angelina's rule-based technical framework could theoretically be manipulated to produce exactly the kind of cascading losses the firm had suffered. The jury, most of whom had no background whatsoever in quantitative trading, listened with the glazed, trusting attention people generally reserve for anyone who sounds like they know more than they do. Cynthia rose for cross-examination without a single note in front of her. "Dr. Whitcomb," she began, her tone almost conversational, "you testified that Ms. Ruble's framework relies on what you called rule-based technical parameters. Could you define, for the jury, what a rule-based technical framework is, in the specific context of perpetual futures trading?" The witness hesitated, just slightly, before offering a definition that was technically accurate, but vague enough to mean almost nothing. "That's a fair general description," Cynthia said. "Now, could you explain the specific difference between a market order execution and a limit order execution within that same framework, as it pertains to slippage during a liquidity cascade?" Another pause, longer this time. "Broadly speaking, market orders execute immediately at the best available price, while limit orders—" "I didn't ask for the broad, textbook definition, Doctor. I asked how the distinction functions specifically within a rule-based algorithmic framework during a liquidity cascade event, the exact scenario you testified about at length 10 minutes ago." Cynthia let the silence stretch, unhurried, entirely comfortable in it. Perhaps it would help if you walked the jury through the actual liquidity mapping data from the incident in question. You did review that raw data yourself, did you not, before forming your expert opinion? The witness's composure cracked, almost imperceptibly. "I reviewed summaries prepared by the prosecution's technical team. Summaries, not the raw order book data itself. The summaries were an accurate representation." "That's not what I asked, Doctor. I asked whether you personally reviewed the raw order book data before testifying, under oath, about precisely how that data demonstrated Miss Ruble's culpability." "No," he admitted finally, quietly, the confidence that had carried him through the prosecutor's questioning, entirely gone now. "I did not review the raw data directly." "So your expert opinion, the opinion this jury has just spent an hour listening to as though it were gospel, is based not on independent analysis of the evidence, but on a summary prepared by the very party paying your consulting fee." The prosecutor rose halfway out of his chair. "Objection," argumentative. "Withdrawn," Cynthia said smoothly, already moving on, because the damage was done, and every juror in the box knew it. "Let's discuss your consulting arrangement with the firm. Doctor, what was your hourly rate for this engagement?" By the time she finished with him 20 minutes later, Dr. Whitcomb's credentials lay in ruins on the courtroom floor, his testimony reduced to an expensive, hollow performance that even the jury's least attentive members could see through. He stepped down from the stand, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, and the prosecutor's confident opening had visibly begun to erode. Marcus Castellan took the stand on the fourth day of trial, called as a hostile witness by the defense, a request that had drawn a heated objection from the prosecution and a lengthy sidebar conference before Judge Holloway, visibly intrigued, despite himself, by the trajectory the case had taken, permitted it. He arrived at the stand in an immaculate navy suit, flanked mentally, if not physically, by the small army of corporate attorneys seated in the gallery behind him, radiating the particular ease of a man who had never once in his adult life been made to answer for anything. He answered Cynthia's opening questions about the firm's oversight structure with barely concealed condescension, the tone of a man explaining something simple to someone he assumed couldn't possibly keep pace with him. "Perhaps it would help, Judge Ruble," he said at one point, an oily smile flickering across his face, "if I explained some of the more technical aspects in simpler terms. I understand these markets can be quite complex for those outside the industry." "That's very generous of you," Cynthia said, entirely unbothered. "Let's discuss the administrative access logs for the firm's proprietary trading APIs. You testified a moment ago that only a small number of senior engineers, including Ms. Ruble, held system-level access to the liquidity mapping tools in question. Is that correct?" "That's correct. And you yourself held no such access, being, as you put it, an executive rather than a technical employee?" "That's correct as well." Cynthia retrieved a document from the defense table and had it entered into evidence, watching Castellan's expression carefully as it was placed in front of him. "This is an internal systems log, subpoenaed directly from your firm's own server infrastructure, showing administrative-level access credentials used to query the liquidity mapping API during the exact 18-minute window in which the cascading trades occurred. Can you identify the credential listed at the top of that log?" A flicker, small but unmistakable, passed across his face. "I'd have to review this more carefully before." "Take your time, Mr. Castellan. I want to make sure the jury understands exactly what they're looking at." He studied the page for a long moment, and when he looked up again, some of the polish had gone out of his voice. "This appears to show my personal administrative credentials. The same credentials you testified, under oath 10 minutes ago, that you did not possess." There may have been a legacy access grant I wasn't aware, remained active." "A legacy access grant you weren't aware of," Cynthia repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air long enough for its absurdity to fully register with the jury. "Let's discuss where the funds went then, Mr. Castellan, since we're already discussing things you may or may not have been aware of." She retrieved a second, thicker set of documents. "This is a record of wire transfers subpoenaed from a holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Meridian Vantage Consolidated. Are you familiar with that entity?" "I'd need to consult with counsel before." "You're welcome to consult with counsel at any point, Mr. Castellan, but I'll remind you that you're under oath right now, answering a direct question. Are you, personally, listed as the beneficial owner of Meridian Vantage Consolidated?" The silence stretched. One of his attorneys shifted forward in his seat, clearly preparing to intervene, but the question had already been asked, already hung in front of the jury, already demanded an answer one way or another. "Yes," he said finally, his voice noticeably tighter now. "And this record shows a series of 11 wire transfers, totaling approximately $31 million, moving from the firm's proprietary trading accounts into Meridian Vantage Consolidated over the same 18-month period during which Ms. Ruble's algorithmic framework was allegedly producing unexplained losses. Can you explain to this jury why funds drained from your own firm's trading positions were flowing directly into an offshore entity that you personally control?" Those transfers were legitimate business expenses, related to $31 million in business expenses, routed through a shell entity in a jurisdiction specifically chosen for its lack of financial disclosure requirements, timed precisely to coincide with trading losses you attributed, under criminal prosecution, to an employee who had zero access to the systems used to execute those exact trades. Cynthia's voice had not risen once, had remained level and precise throughout, but every word now landed with the force of a verdict already half decided. Mr. Castellan, isn't it true that you personally accessed Ms. Ruble's liquidity mapping data, used it to engineer a targeted cascade through your firm's own perpetual futures positions, drained the resulting funds into an offshore account under your control, and then orchestrated Ms. Ruble's arrest, specifically to close out a federal regulatory investigation that was closing in on your own conduct? Objection, the prosecutor shouted, on his feet now, but the courtroom had already tipped past the point where objections could undo what had been said. The jury will disregard, Judge Holloway began. I want to answer, Castellan said suddenly, his voice cracking, the polish entirely gone now, 30 seconds of accumulated pressure, finally overwhelming 30 years of practiced composure. I want to answer the question. His attorney leaned forward urgently, hand nearly on his client's arm. Don't. I need to invoke my Fifth Amendment right, Castellan said instead, the words coming out strangled, defeated. And I am not answering any further questions without separate counsel. The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway's gavel came down twice, 3 times, struggling to reclaim order over the sudden roar of the gallery, the frantic whispered conference between Castellan and his legal team, the visible shock rippling across the prosecutor's face as he watched the foundation of his entire case collapse in real time in front of the jury he'd spent 4 days trying to convince. Cynthia remained standing at the podium, entirely still amid the chaos, and allowed herself, finally, the faintest trace of something that might have been called satisfaction. It took the prosecution 3 more days to fully unravel, 3 days in which the offshore records, once formally entered into evidence, drew federal investigators into the courtroom gallery, in which the prosecutor's own name surfaced, in a separate set of wire records, tracing payments from a Meridian Vantage subsidiary directly into an account held by his brother-in-law, in which the hired expert witness quietly retained separate counsel of his own, rather than risk a perjury charge for his earlier testimony. On the final morning, Judge Holloway called the courtroom to order, with an unusually somber expression, the docket in front of him, considerably thinner than it had been when the trial began. In light of evidence entered into the record over the past several days, he said, addressing the courtroom, including confirmed falsification of forensic evidence, confirmed prosecutorial financial misconduct, and testimony obtained through what this court now believes to be a deliberately fabricated criminal case, this court has no choice but to dismiss all charges against the defendant, Angelina Ruble, with prejudice. He paused, letting the words settle, then continued, his voice hardening. This court is referring Mr. Castellan for immediate arrest and prosecution, pending charges to be filed by federal prosecutors. The conduct of the prosecuting attorney in this matter will be referred to the State Bar's Ethics Committee for immediate review, alongside a parallel criminal investigation into his own financial dealings with the defendant entity. The gavel came down one final time, and the sound seemed to release something that had been held taut in the courtroom for weeks. Angelina sat frozen for a moment, the words dismissed with prejudice, taking a long moment to fully penetrate the exhaustion and disbelief that had carried her through the last several months, before the reality of it finally broke over her, and her shoulders began to shake, silent tears finally slipping free after weeks of forcing herself to hold them back in public. Cynthia reached over and set her hand on her niece's shoulder. Not a small gesture this time, not a brief, careful touch, but a real one, steady and unhurried, the kind of contact she hadn't allowed herself in 6 long years. It's over, she said quietly. You did this, Angelina managed, her voice thick. You gave up everything. Your career, your reputation. They threatened your pension. I didn't give up anything that mattered, Cynthia said, and for once in her life, the words came without the careful, measured distance she usually kept, even in her warmest moments. I spent a long time believing that protecting the integrity of the law meant keeping myself separate from the people I loved. I think I had that backward. The law only means something if it protects people. If it can't protect my own family from being crushed by the very system I've spent my life defending, then it isn't worth very much at all. They walked out of the courthouse together, into a bright, ordinary afternoon, the kind of sunlight that felt almost startling after weeks spent under fluorescent lights and gray courtroom windows. Reporters clustered near the steps, shouting questions that neither of them stopped to answer. Angelina, still in the plain clothes she'd worn for the verdict, rather than the jumpsuit she'd arrived in months earlier, looked over at her aunt, sharp, unyielding, immaculately composed even now, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, like she was looking at family rather than a stranger who happened to share her last name. What happens now? Angelina asked, as they reached the bottom of the steps, and the noise of the crowd began to fade behind them. With your bench? With everything you risked? I imagine there will be an inquiry, Cynthia said, entirely unbothered by the prospect. There usually is, when a sitting judge does something the institution didn't expect. I'll answer their questions honestly, the way I always have, and we'll see what they decide to do with the answers. And if they take it from you, the bench, everything you built? Cynthia was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful weight she gave every serious question, before she answered. Then I'll have lost a title, she said. I won't have lost you a second time. I think, all things considered, that's a trade I can live with. Angelina reached over, hesitant at first, and took her aunt's hand, an unfamiliar gesture between them, but one that Cynthia, after only the briefest pause, returned. They walked the rest of the way to the car in silence, the kind of silence that no longer needed filling. 6 years of distance finally, quietly, closing behind them with every step.